Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a fascinating journey into the past. Today, we are honored to host local author Dawn Wilding, who will share the powerful and often dramatic stories behind the historic storms of Cape Cod, events that have shaped the landscape, communities, and character of the region we know today. So please join me in welcoming Dawn Wilding.
Thank you, Amy. Always a pleasure to be back here. And thank you, everybody, for coming out here today, braving the elements and such. I've been following the paths, you might say, or the stories of some of the storms of Cape Cod for many, many years, especially the blizzard of '78. But a couple of years ago, I published what was my fifth book, Historic Storms of Cape Cod. And that features a lot of the great storms, weather events that have happened here on the Cape. Today, I'll touch upon the ones that I prominently featured in the book. And there's so many more, though, that I could get into. Unfortunately, we've only got so much time here. So without further ado, I'll get on to all of the or some of the storms that are featured here. The thing about storms on Cape Cod, it's almost like a, sort of a thing for people to rush to the beach. It's almost like a sport. People flock to the beach anytime they hear the Weather Channel or any of the weather alerts going off. Oh, I got to get to the beach, see what happens, because nature puts on a show. It's really something to watch. My friend, the late Nan Turner Waldron, she wrote a book called Journey to Outermost House many years ago. And she wrote in that book, every one of us needs to feel beyond self, to feel small, measured against distant horizons, to feel powerless against the winds, to feel voiceless against the thunder of the storm. Cape Cod has a lot of special features which affect the damage storms can do here. Sustained high winds can push seawater high, far above high tide levels, especially in the enclosed bays. Buzzards Bay collects high water and hurricane winds from the south. Cape Cod Bay fills up during nor'easters. The shallows east and south of the Cape get very choppy in storms, the same way that the North Sea often does. I'll cover mostly here today hurricanes and nor'easters, and I'll touch upon hurricanes here first. The name hurricane, it comes from the Mayan god Huracan, who, according to an account from the Chatham Historical Society, sent his thunderbolts and ferocious windstorms upon the people and blew the seas into raging fury that swept all creatures before him into death and destruction. Cape mariners would later come face to face with Huracan's towering anger, and they developed a very healthy respect for it. So when you look at hurricanes, it could be the hurricanes that are coming across the ocean from off the coast of Africa, the Cape Verde hurricanes. They tend to be really giant storms. They take over a week to cross the Atlantic. And the ones that develop in the area of the Bahamas, well, they tend to be smaller. They will accelerate up the coast, but they give very little lead time. Something to remember with hurricane forecasts. A rule of thumb, a storm has to be at 72 degrees west longitude around the Bahamas to have a chance of hitting us. If it's any further east than that, chances are it's not going to hit us. Or if it's further west, it'll probably hit Florida or the Gulf or somewhere like that. The point when New England needs to take action is when there's a named storm in the Bahamas, right? So if it's off the North Carolina coast, you're late. You're already late. You're already having impacts from the storm when it's that close. An example of that was Hurricane Bob. That was one of those kind of hurricanes. Nor'easters, well, we're right in the path of these powerful storms. They develop in the latitudes between Georgia and New Jersey. and usually within 100 miles east or west of the East Coast. And the storms progress generally northeastward, typically attain maximum intensity near New England and the maritime provinces of Canada. So that's what we usually will be dealing with when it comes to big storms. With this is a quote from Henry Beston in his book The Outermost House. He describes the intensity of a nor'easter. He said, "With the turn of the tide came fury unbelievable. The great rhythm of its waters now at one with the rhythm of the wind. The ocean rose out of the night to attack the ancient rivalry of earth, hurling breaker after thundering breaker against the long bulwark of sands." And this has happened again and again and again. Probably one of the worst nor'easters to ever hit Cape Cod happened back in 1898. It was a storm known as the Portland Gale. This is a storm I wrote an entire book about. If there is a storm that is comparable with the blizzard of 78, this is it, the Portland Gale. They called it the Portland Gale, not because of so much what it did to the city of Portland, but it was because of what happened to the steamer Portland. Almost 200 lives were lost during that storm. It was described as a night to try men's souls, a night when the strongest of men trembled and when women wept. And it was a night that should witness deeds of human bravery, a night of agony and of death. It was a night when the Coast Guardsman was remembered. And as I mentioned, it was named for its namesake city in Maine. The Portland was heading from Boston to Portland, Maine during this storm. They didn't really have an inkling of what was really coming. After all, this was only 1898. You didn't have weather radar. You didn't have satellite reports. You didn't have Jim Cantori going out on the beach. 141 vessels were wrecked at sea, including the Portland. A total of 456 lives were lost, mostly at sea. You can kind of see the path here of where the Portland left Boston on the night of November 26th. This was Thanksgiving weekend, so people were traveling. They were leaving Boston on the steamer, paddle steamer, which was one of the ways to travel in those days. It was either that or the railroad. So they left Boston, heading for Portland, and the storm kicked in. Hurricane force winds within a couple of hours, driving snow. Around here on the North Shore, people started to see that the Portland was going by and it didn't have its lights on. It was losing pieces of its infrastructure. Started to drift out to sea. By the middle of the night, it wasn't anywhere near Portland. It was going further out to sea, then it drifted down here, where it finally went under the waves at around 10 a.m. Sunday. They first thought that it struck off the beach of Cape Cod, somewhere off of Truro or Highland Light or Provincetown. Wasn't the case. It actually was about 20 miles northeast of Provincetown, along Stellwagen Bank. And the remains of it are there to this day. The keeper at Highland Light recorded a wind gust of 90 miles an hour. That was actually happened across the region, some 100 miles an hour. Visibility at sea, 100 yards at best. And 200 vessels from Maine to Martha's Vineyard were scrambling for safe harbor during that storm. The life-saving service, the men who would go out and keep an eye out for ships in distress, they were kept pretty busy during the storm. They worked like fiends, is what the Portland Daily Press said. The sand, the blowing sand, is something they had to face in the storms all the time. The sand cut their faces until they were raw and bleeding. That was the conditions they had to face. The sand was the worst thing. That was worse than the sleet or rain or snow or anything else that they had to face. The Pollock Rip lightship. They used to have lightships off the coast of Cape Cod that would, they kind of served as floating lighthouses. Pollock Rip broke from its moorings, drifted off. It finally stopped and settled near the Delaware Capes before they were able to stop it and get it back to its home. And the harbors at Provincetown and Vineyard Haven, schooners were tossed around like toys. It was a pretty bad scene in both places. The railroad tracks here on the Cape, particularly in Sandwich and West Barnstable, right up not too far from here, and also in North Truro near Provincetown, were washed out. It derailed train travel for several days. Trees were down Cape wide. Now, you might have remembered this from the recent storm. A lot of trees were snapped in half, but here you see there was more than that going on. There were just across the Cape, trees coming down were a big problem. And the Portland Gale probably saw more of that than most storms, that and some of the hurricanes that came, and I'll get to that later. In fact, I'm getting to it right now. 1938 hurricane. This one may have been the overall worst storm to ever hit Cape Cod in terms of damage that happened here. This storm moved northward from the Caribbean at a forward speed of 60 miles an hour. That's unheard of when you see something like that, because when a storm is moving that fast, that also accelerates the wind speed within the storm. So it was going 60 miles an hour over the open Atlantic. And then when it hit land, it was still moving at 50 plus miles an hour over Long Island and Connecticut. The Blue Hill Observatory outside of Boston recorded sustained winds at 121 miles an hour, 186 mile an hour gusts. And the storm surges were 18 to 25 feet in Buzzards Bay. So that just flooded out everything. And 20 feet of water was in downtown Providence and 8 feet of water in Woods Hole. So this is just gives you an idea of what it looked like here. Then came the dawn. This was a Wareham newspaper editor who described what happened. Words cannot describe it. To the writer, whose own newspaper plant had been under 6 feet of water, the thought came to him, and as it must have to all who sustained like losses, that the blow was too great to realize. Where to begin, what to do? Nobody knew, but everybody began to do something, futile as it might seem. In Falmouth, there was a story of a woman who drowned after her car ran out of gas on Beach Road near the Moore Pavilion. She was out with her nephew, and they were doing some shopping. And they said, wait, the nephew said, we should probably go get some gas. She said, no, let's just go home. So as they're going home, they run out of gas here. And the nephew runs to get gas. They had to do something. And he says, you want to come with me? And she says, no, I'll stay here with the car and I'll watch it and I'll watch the storm. Well, after a while, she is seen leaving the car and getting out and then just disappeared. So they didn't really even know what happened to her, but she was probably taken away by the high surf that came in. There was also a Silver Beach couple that fled to the roof of their house. They had to climb up on the roof because they were in the living room. Water came in, went upstairs. Water kept coming in upstairs. Then they climbed on the roof, and finally the floodwaters get high enough, it rips the roof off the house and carries it away in a big river, fast-moving river. And they died when the roof crashed into another house. So it was just high-speed acceleration when that happened. There was another cottage that also was taken away by floodwaters. 5 residents of a Gray Gables cottage in Bourne lost their lives. This one dropped into Buzzards Bay, swept into the Cape Cod Canal, and it finally came to rest right there at the foot of the Bourne Bridge. So they had to remove the victims from a hole in the cottage's roof. On the left here, you see, this is downtown Buzzards Bay area, right near the entrance to Mass Maritime. And this is the train station. all underwater. You can see the railroad bridge in the background there. This is all submerged, and this is some more footage from the area. And scientists were convinced that the water rose here because it was caught in a bottleneck. This is that 18 to 25-foot storm surge. And you also had abnormally high tides during this as well. So the tide was just rising as the wind was rising. All the timing was perfect for this storm and the way it just came in. So this kind of left a lot of question marks afterwards, a lot of second guessing. Well, there were 500 to 600 deaths inland from this storm. About 18 people died on the Cape. And they decided we have to have better preparation because nobody knew that storm was coming. They had no clue. There were some reports coming from down south about severe weather moving up the coast, but nobody really knew what was going on. So by the time the next storm hit, which was in September of 1944, this was another Category 3 hurricane. Fortunately, this one arrived 3 hours after high tide. And the mid and lower Cape actually sustained more damage than the upper Cape did in this storm. The upper Cape is the one that got most hit hard in 1938. This one was more in this area. And while nobody died on land here on the Cape, at sea, it was a different story. The Vineyard lightship, number 73, it was at its usual station near Cuttyhunk Island in Vineyard Sound. And this one went to the bottom during this storm that they called the Great Atlantic Hurricane. 12 men died. They were told to remain at their station. They wanted to get out. They said, no, remain at your station. They had to ride out the storm. They didn't make it. The region's getting battered by 105-mile-an-hour winds. The storm surge was 8 to 10 feet, less than the previous storm, but still not what you want. Flares were spotted in the vicinity of the lightship's location. And then after a while, they vanished. And that meant also because the Vineyard had vanished, the lightship. The bell from that ship is now on display at the New Bedford waterfront. There's a lot more details on this story in the book. West Dennis was hit particularly hard by this storm. Lower County Road in West Dennis under 8 feet of water. The Lighthouse Inn suffered its worst damage ever. They had just built a new dining room off the side of the building just 3 months earlier. Gone, washed away into Weir Creek on the other side of the road there. And it also destroyed 27 cottages right near the inn. Chatham boats were swept from the Stage Harbor shore, piled up on Turns Island. Another building collapsed, and the 2 wharves where State Harbor fishing fleets tied up, they were swept away too. And winds blew the steeple off the Chatham Universalist Church, and the Morris Island Bridge was completely washed out at that point. Now, down trees. We had a lot of them here last month, but after this storm, there were so many trees here. They used German POWs who were at Camp Edwards. They had a prisoner of war camp there during World War II. These POWs were used during the cleanup of the downed trees. And this just gives you an idea. 4 sawmills were brought into by the U.S. Army to turn all these trees into useful lumber. So go ahead another 10 years, and now you've got 2 storms that happened within a 12-day period, 13-day period, or 12 days. The last century, this is Glenn Field talking, the warning coordination meteorologist who I spent probably 2 or 3 hours with one afternoon, and he explained all this stuff to me. And he said the last century had 4 significant hurricanes, all come within a 16-year period. Now, we haven't had anything now in 35 years. and counting. And Carol and Edna happened in 1954, within 12 days of each other. The one on the left is Carol. Followed a very similar path to the 1938 hurricane. Edna just came right up over Cape Cod and over Cape Cod Bay, but moved pretty quickly. But they were both pretty severe storms. Carol was almost a twin to the 38 hurricane. Category 3 coincided with high tide as it moved northward with a forward speed of 40 miles an hour. Still pretty fast, not as fast as 38, but still pretty fast. Storm surge was 14 feet, 82 100-mile-an-hour winds. High tide, 10 and a half and 11 feet above high water on the Falmouth shore of Buzzards Bay. Again, pretty bad. This shows in Woods Hole this Coast Guard cutter just floating around near the dock. And there was a story I got from a woman who, when she was 13 years old, her and her family had been planning this trip out to Sampson Island in Pleasant Bay. And come hell or high water, they were going to do this camping trip. Well, they got both. And they had the time of their lives, she said. We had a ball. We had all the goodies to eat. We had a dog with us. They spent most of the time in the tents because the wind was whipping around, but it was on the outer Cape, which didn't feel the impact quite as hard as, say, Falmouth or even this area. So they went on this camping trip. They rode out the storm, and they had to end up being rescued by the Coast Guard because somebody on the mainland knew about it and said, you better go out there and get these people. And she told me afterwards that she said, God, I can't imagine what the other parents were thinking after we went out for this event during a storm. Then came Hurricane Edna a couple of weeks later. And one of the big headlines from this storm was another lightship that almost perished. Fortunately, these guys survived. The 959-ton floating lighthouse Nantucket. The rudder was gone. Her bridge was almost demolished, roped into port under tow. Aboard was the 12-man crew who couldn't have abandoned ship even if they wanted to. So they were lucky. And the way the storm tracked too, it went over first. There was a storm surge that usually happens after the hurricane goes over you. Well, it happened on the south side of the Cape first, and then as it passed over, it had another storm surge that happened in the bay, and it hit Wellfleet Harbor pretty hard. The maximum storm surge of 10 feet in Wellfleet Harbor, an hour and a half after the eye had passed over the southern part of the Cape. So now we get to this storm, and Amy and I just set up a talk about this exclusively for next winter. But this storm, how many of you remember it? Okay. How many of you were here on the Cape for this storm? Okay, this was a different deal for the most part on Cape Cod. Some parts of the Cape got a lot of snow. The outer Cape turned to rain very quickly. After the first night, it had turned to rain. Snow was all gone practically on the outer Cape. This was the scene at Coast Guard Beach. There used to be a parking lot and a bathhouse out in front of the Coast Guard station. That changed the landscape of that entire outer beach. I think the outer Cape got hit harder than anybody when it came to tidal damage. A friend of mine was a news reporter. His name is Bob C. He used to work for WOMR and also for the radio station out in Orleans during the storm. And Bob told me, he said, this wasn't really a snow event. He said, this was a tidal event because of the way it happened. This was the forecast. This is a very routine nor'easter forecast. We were getting stuff like this last month before that storm. And then what happened here, unlike last month, you had these very high tides. extremely high tides. These were record high tides at the time. On February 6, 1978, 14 and a half feet above mean low water. That's 4 feet above normal. So you just had this incredibly high level of water. And plus high winds of 92 miles an hour, or unofficially, somebody had it at 120. Coast Guard Beach bathhouse parking lot completely destroyed. And a 50-foot long concrete septic tank was unearthed near the bathhouse. This was the scene from the Coast Guard station, looking out over what a lot of people call Nauset Spit, or the Nauset Barrier Beach, looking southward, completely run over. This is a barrier beach that protects Nauset Marsh from the Atlantic. Well, it didn't work during this storm. It just completely overwashed everything. Now, there were a lot of beach camps out there, as they call them. Some people call them dune shacks or cottages. This is one of them that was called the Butterfly House. It was built by an architect named Conrad Nobley, and this was taken from the air. There was a local airline pilot photographer named Dick Kelsey who went over the storm. This storm had an eye, so it was actually clear here on the Cape for a portion, while it's snowing like crazy up in Boston and on the South Shore. Here on the Cape, sun's out, it's 45 degrees. People are going out to the beach with picnics to watch what the ocean was doing, because it was quite a show. This is the Butterfly House after the storm, just turned on its side. Also claimed in that storm was the famous outermost house, the cottage used by Henry Beston where he wrote his famous book. That was destroyed during this storm. This is the outermost house before the storm in a dune. This is afterwards. Just a flat sandbar with just with 4 posts sticking up. This is also after the storm. What was left of the outermost house, some of the pieces of it. Henry Lind and Conrad Nobley, the owner of the Butterfly House, they're holding pieces of that house. And this is the scene part of the scene from Coast Guard Beach, looking out over the bathhouse, which was being destroyed by these waves. And this is what it looked like before the storm. It was a bathhouse and a huge parking lot out in front there. And Robert Finch, the famous Cape Cod essay writer, told me back in 2014, he was talking about this storm, and he said there were hundreds of people there just watching the waves, and they were just smashing up against the bathhouse. And with every wave that hit, he said the crowds would just cheer. And he said, why is that? What are we cheering about? Because everybody's awestruck by it. He said, but that stuck in my mind after that, during that storm. He said there were hundreds of people out there watching this going on the beach. They were standing up high, of course. This is another story that happened during the first night of the storm, and the ocean was really kicking in. And some people knew this was going to be dangerous. Well, there was a group of young people who were driving in a Volkswagen Bug down to the beach during the storm, and it's nighttime, it's dark, and they drive down into the parking lot, and they're driving along. And I've heard different accounts of this now, but this is how I've narrowed it down from what everybody's told me. The Volkswagen went in to the parking lot, and as they're driving in, it's dark. The waves are sneaking in behind them. They don't know these waves are coming in. And before they know it, the waves go under the car, lift it up, their lights go out in the car, carries it into Nauset Marsh, and these kids don't know where they're going. They don't know what's happening, and they're scared for their lives. And they're floating around in here, and they look up at the Coast Guard station, and somebody's got their lights on in the parking lot in back of the Coast Guard station. They said this is what saved their lives, because they were able to get out of the car, get through this ice cold water that's there, and up the hill there to safety. They said otherwise, if they had seen that, they might have perished. And that bug sat there in the marsh for a couple of days. Tow truck came, local station in Orleans. They brought it to the station, cleaned out everything out, changed the fluids, put the ignition in the car. It starts. As Bob C. told me, he said Volkswagen should have been there to make a commercial about how adorable, because this is salt water too, and that's not particularly friendly to car engines. This was the scene in Provincetown. You see the Lobster Pot restaurant here. The water actually made it up onto Commercial Street, as it did during the Portland Gale also. This is out on the dunes. This is one of the dune shacks that ended up hanging over the edge here. And the dune shack's owner, his dog is checking out, looking down into the surf. And they actually had to get this bulldozer out there to push it back, save it. Monomoy Island off of Chatham was split into 3 pieces. This is constantly changing and has a few times, I think, since this storm. Waves broke through the 30-foot dunes at Boston Beach and Truro as well. This was the first storm that really flooded the Pamet River, which is just on the other side of the dune from the beach, the beginning of it. So as the water broke through there, you had, that actually made the outer cape into an island. So it made that part of the cape into an island, and also high tide at in Eastham, right near the Rotary, or just past the Rotary in Eastham, water came in from both sides too and flooded Route 6. So people couldn't get out of Eastham to get to Orleans at that point. And of course, people tried to drive through that too, and few people lost their engines as a result. So with all this happening, people were still reeling from 1978 for years. Changed Coast Guard Beach. That's why you have to take that little bus now from the parking lot near Doan Rock down to Coast Guard Beach, because there's no real parking lot down there anymore, except for the little one behind the Coast Guard station. So things had changed quite a bit. Well, there was going to be more change during this storm. This is in 1987. There was a lot of snow inland. Out here, it was mostly high tides again, and high winds, 68 miles an hour at Chatham. But this January 2nd, 1987 storm, one of the big headlines from it was something called syzygy. Syzygy, S-Y-Z-Y-G-Y, it's spelled. This term describes a lineup of Earth, Moon, and Sun when the Moon aligns directly opposite the Earth and Sun, or between the two bodies. So the alignment actually bulges the tides in some areas of the Earth. Well, that's what happened in Chatham. You had this breakthrough of the barrier beach. The Chatham Bar was no longer solid. It was protecting Chatham Harbor for many, many years, but this had been building up for a long time. It was a process that I was told took about 140, 150 years. And first it cut a 200-yard swath through the beach, North Beach, across from the Chatham Coast Guard station. And then by January 16th, just 2 weeks later, an hour after high tide, the inlet measured 400+ feet across. And then February 3rd, it was up to over 1,600 feet. So it kept expanding that whole time. And that's what actually created North and South Beach. And this image kind of shows you a before and after. This is 1986. You got that solid bar of that protected Chatham Harbor. After the storm, here's what happened. You had that big break. This has kept changing now constantly over the last several years. There's been one storm after another, and it keeps having a different alignment. Graham Geiss from the Center for Coastal Studies, he was watching all this very closely. Graham kind of broke it down for me a couple of years ago while I was researching the book. And he said this, he described that 150-year pattern. He said in 1987, it had a wonderful storm to work with. But the tidal dynamics had changed over that 150 years. And the inlet way up north, Chatham Harbor responds pretty quickly to what the ocean tides are. The barrier beach grows southward. Then the tide takes longer to get into the harbor from the ocean. And as time goes on, it takes longer and longer. And finally, in the 1960s, 70s, into the 80s, it got down to Monomoy. So the tides were really small range inside Chatham Harbor compared to the ocean. And that's a huge differential when you get a big storm. And it overwashes it, then it's kind of like a waterfall coming down, rushing in, and then an inlet forms, and then there's a big low tide after it, so it rushes out again. If that all makes any sense, but that's how it kind of gradually happened. So you've had these big changes in the outer beach, but you still got the hurricanes coming too. The outer beach tends to get hit more by the nor'easters and up on the bay side too. The hurricanes tend to hit us from the south. Hurricane Bob, a lot of you probably remember this storm from August of 1991. The peak wind gusts were in Brewster and North Truro, 125 miles an hour, 85 in Provincetown, 100-mile-an-hour winds sustained in North Truro. The storm surges 12 to 15 feet around Buzzards Bay. This was a scene from Truro, actually from Provincetown. It's right inside the border. It's called the Sandcastle Resort these days. It's along Route 6A as you're heading into Provincetown. I used to stay in a house very regularly right next door to this place, so I was pretty familiar with it. And then I saw the story about what had happened here. And there were people that were stuck inside when this happened. The winds just blew the roof right off the place. And so you had all this damage there. And the lady who was the manager of the Sandcastle had told me, she dug up these photographs, but then she told me that during the storm, she had been living in Provincetown on Commercial Street. And she said there were people out in the street. It was not raining a lot, but it was a lot of wind. And people are out in the street partying. They're going crazy, having parties out in the street while all this wind is going on. And she thought, oh, wow, this is cool. I'll walk around a little bit. And then she saw a roof fly by, a roof of a building. She said, I'm going back in. Now I'm not staying out here. So it was, the wind was a big event. There were a lot of roofs torn off of buildings, and especially up in Provincetown. And of course, here in down in Falmouth and that area, again, you had that big flooding from Buzzards Bay, so there was a lot of damage down there as well. This is over in Orleans, a couple of buildings that got whacked, including the windmill there, lost a couple of its blades. And of course, the siding here on the Oddfellows Hall in Orleans. This is from again, the Lighthouse Inn in Dennis. Some more damage. They told me there that over the years, they never really had much from nor'easters. It was the hurricanes that, because of the direction they face, which brings the wind out of from a southerly direction. Just the flooding here was phenomenal. But in 1991, Hurricane Bob was only the beginning. Then you had another storm that hit in October. And there weren't a lot of explanations that were readily available for this storm. It was first called, it's known now as the perfect storm because of the movie and the book. Beforehand, it was first called the Halloween Gale or the No-Name Storm, because this was a combination of, you might remember the scene from the movie The Perfect Storm, where the meteorologist is there looking at it and he's seeing how everything's coming together, and he's the perfect storm. And that's really what happened. You had 3 weather systems coming together. And they said that although the Hurricane Center considered classifying this as a hurricane, Two other agencies decided against this to avoid unnecessarily confusing and alarming the public, because it consisted of a fading hurricane, Hurricane Grace. The energy was out over the Atlantic, dying out, but it was still a potent weather system. It was absorbed by this storm that was developing off of Canada, and then a very strong cold front came barreling through. And all three of them came together all at once over the ocean. So you had the path of it starting off the Canadian Maritimes, then going down, looping just past Cape Cod, down to the mid-Atlantic coastal area, and then back up into Canada eventually. So this took several days, this storm. And they said they felt it, the effects were felt from Canada all the way to Florida, almost. And the title was coined between the author of the book, The Perfect Storm, Sebastian Junger, and Robert Case. He was a National Weather Service meteorologist. They're the ones that came up with the name. On the Cape, we had wind gusts of 78 miles an hour on Morris Island and Chatham, 79 at McMillan Pier in Provincetown. The Outer Cape probably got hit the hardest from this. The weather buoy off of Nova Scotia recorded a wave exceeding 100 feet. So you remember those scenes from the movie where George Clooney's trying to get the boat up over that wave. That's probably what they were playing off of, because they don't know what happened to the Andrea Gale. They really don't know exactly what happened. But 100-foot waves out there. Just east of the Cape, they had wave heights of close to 40 feet. So this was battering the shores of Cape Cod for over a week. There was an experience down on North Beach, the Second Village, it's called, all these beach camps that are down there. This is not the same storm. I just used this for an effect in this photograph. Bruce and Donna Edson, they were staying at their beach camp in the Second Village of North Beach in Chatham, and they began sensing something wasn't quite right during the days leading up to Halloween in 1991. They were marooned out there because of the conditions. They couldn't get off the beach at this point. And several neighbors and friends staged what was called a heroic rescue by ORVs. They managed to get them ashore. They couldn't get any kind of boat out there. They couldn't even get a helicopter out there. That's how severe the conditions were. And so they tried this as the tide was coming in. One of the rescuers said the ride was off the beach was pedal to the metal. He said, your foot's stuck right to the floor and the transmissions are heating up and the sand is nothing but soup. So he's trying to drive through this and you're sinking in. So if you stop, you're going to get stuck. And the adrenaline is really pumping. Well, fortunately, somehow they got out. They were very fortunate. Nauset Light Beach in Eastham lost 10 feet of cliff just over the course of that storm. Stairs were washed away. Fence overlooking a 40-foot overlook was claimed by the waves. 3 structures in Eastham along Nauset Marsh were claimed. This is the remains of one that my friend John March and I found in 2006. And this was a house that was washed away during that 91 storm. I went back there a couple of years ago. That roof is now no longer anywhere to be found. So the ocean has since taken it away. And Truro also, back to the Boston Beach breakthrough there, originally in 78. An 82-foot cut through the dunes from this storm, created by the high surf. And Grays Beach in Yarmouthport, 1,000-foot boardwalk that actually was kind of winding out into the marsh there. The one that you see there today was damaged last month, but this one here went out even further. That was destroyed in this storm. Actually was destroyed in the 78 storm too. So this was after the storm. Mildred Champlin, who was her Her family had a dune shack out there for years. They came back from Michigan. They had just left the Cape. They spend their summers on the Cape, go to Michigan for the winter, and then come back. And she said, we came back Friday, November 1st, a week after we left the Cape. We returned to check on the damage inflicted by the worst storm we had ever endured. The house had gone through 5 days of that enormous storm, 10 high moon tides, 10 high tides. And these were new moon tides. So it was really pretty bad after a while. They went to the dune's edge, stunned to be looking out rather than out over the 100 feet of grass we had a week before. The storm had clawed away maybe 75 feet of our frontage. The ocean was almost lapping at our feet, so they could, this just gives you an idea of what it did. That pipe there, you could get under it after the storm. Before, you had to just step over it. So I call this part the Storm Chronicles. This is Eastham, right off of the Rotary. As you go into Eastham on Route 6, you see Collins Cove. It's a group of cottages that are there. And this is what they called the shucking house. The Collins family had owned this until very recently. They had built it back in the 1920s and had rented out these properties. But they also ran a shell fishing business out of here. The shucking house, in 1978, it flooded because of that part of Eastham was getting severely flooded. And Ken Collins would mark the level the storms had reached in the way that some measure the growth of children. On the wall, they would mark it. Instead of the kid's height, it was the height, how high the water got. So the 78 storm was only about shin high, hard to believe. Then the big storm of 87 was waist high, and the marks of 1991, perfect storm, they cover the garage. So that one was the highest one there. Now, a lot of times when you ask what's the worst storm, it depends where you are. It's now a lot of people have been talking about this one, Blizzard of 2026 last month. How does it rate? What do you guys think? Think it's an all-timer or was just really bad? I mean, I would say personally, compared to some of these other storms, it was just pretty bad. This was some of the erosion on Coast Guard Beach. Erosion was not a major issue with this storm compared to other storms. So it was the power outages, the tree damage, yeah. But once you get past that, I don't really see it afterwards. Some of the destruction, there was no fatalities or anything like that. And we were warned too. We were warned about this storm. People were prepared, unlike 1938 or the Portland Gale or anything else. Is the worst yet to come? I would say bet on it. Glenn Field also said bet on it. The Weather Service meteorologist. He said the worst case scenario was a storm with the potency of the 1938 hurricane moving over New England again. Yes, it can happen, because another storm that had the potency of the 1938 hurricane was the Great Colonial Hurricane of 1635, which happened in the time of the Pilgrims. That also had what was believed to be 20 feet plus storm surges in Buzzards Bay. So if something like this comes over, he says it's not a question of if, it's a question of when it will happen. In this case, a northern movement of the storm making landfall near Foxwoods in Connecticut, that drives a 20-foot surge into Narragansett Bay. If it goes up Narragansett Bay, then you've got that 20-plus foot surge going into Buzzards Bay, like it did in 1938. There would be 30 feet of water at Parkwood Beach in Wareham. Compare that to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005. That was 25 feet. So you would have a Hurricane Katrina type of situation in Buzzards Bay in this area. That's if it happens, which is increasingly likely. It will happen probably at some point. Mildred told me also about in the dunes, she had said, we viewed the devastation and I said I'd never again look forward to predicting the future. All we know is that Mother Nature is in charge. And we have to be grateful for all the years we've had and enjoy right now. So far, we've been lucky. Another perfect storm will come in the future. We know that. After the Hurricane Bob in 1991, the last hurricane we've had, so we're kind of overdue. It's been 35 years. The Cape Codder the editor must have grabbed one of the reporters and say, hey, call the Orleans Senior Center and see how they made out over there during the storm. And the director there told them, the seniors, they didn't have any problems. He said, they all know what to do. He said, it's the young people like us who had to figure things out. So we think we live in such a sophisticated world, but nature humbles us. So I'd like to thank you for coming here today. And I can, if you want, I can run down a couple of other storms if you want to know about them. A lot of them are in the book. But my next effort is Prohibition on Cape Cod, Running the Rum In. So I'm going off track a little bit here, but that's my next book. It's coming out May 12th. It's available for pre-order now online. And I do have also upcoming talks I'll be doing about that in Brewster, Falmouth, West Dennis, and Truro in June and July. And also a talk on Henry Beston's Cape Cod, how the outermost house inspired a national seashore. That'll be in Eastham on July 30th. And yes, $25. I'm sorry, it's cash only today. But those will be available after the presentation. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, what you described of how the no-name storm, the perfect storm, is formed with the Hurricane Grace that was dying out, but was still an active system, with the low pressure to the south, the cold front to the south, and then weather a surge manifesting from Canada, to the north. That the manner in which it all came together, fused in this catastrophic force, it could happen within, possibly within the coming decade.
It could happen next week.
Yeah,
it really could.
Because as you were talking about it, I thought of when I was watching it. It was either a program on the Weather Channel or some other source I was watching on YouTube that some meteorologist was talking about how the concept of a 100-year storm is practically happening almost every year, either in this neck of the woods or maritime nations throughout the world.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. Absolutely. And yeah, it could happen. I mean, the 100-year storm concept, I mean, you could get a few 100-year storms in a very short period of time. During this century, from 2005 on, we've seen some monster weather events out here. That's why I look at last month's storm and say, yeah, that was bad, but look back to January of 25 when we had 3 feet of snow and 80-mile-an-hour winds here on the Cape. Or there was one guy that was from Siberia. He had lived in Siberia, and he said it was never that bad.
Right.
When he was living there. Also, later that year, in December of 2005, I don't know how many people remember this, but you had to be here for it because you didn't really hear much about it beyond Cape Cod. There was a nor'easter that came through on December 9th, 2005, that, it dumped 6 inches of snow over the Boston area and such. It was kind of raining out here for the most part of the day, and it was, lousy weather, but Later in the day, the sun came out in the afternoon and everything was mysteriously calm. But this was that eerie calm before the storm sort of thing. And all of a sudden, the sky got very, very dark and the wind kicked in. I've been through 3 hurricanes. I've never seen wind like that or heard wind like that. The wind gusts were about 100 miles an hour that were happening during that storm. It just came out of nowhere and caused all kinds of downed trees. There were a lot of downed trees across, especially the outer Cape. Brewster, I remember large trees that had been there for a very long time were uprooted over Route 6A. Dolphins were washing up on Cape Cod, along Cape Cod Bay. There were like 40 or 50 dolphins that were beached because they got disoriented during the storm. And that happens during storms. So if you go to the Cape Cod National Seashore now, and if you go down towards Coast Guard Beach and around Dome Rock down to the beach, if you look in the woods, you'll see a lot of downed trees from almost 20 years ago now, from that storm. It came and hit very hard. There wasn't much of anything left, as far as power. People were out of power for days after that storm. And that one's kind of forgotten. But that's one of the craziest events I've ever seen. And then, of course, there was 2013, 2015, 2018, 2022. We've had some doozies in those just in that span. So it's kind of hard to keep track of. But yeah, when they start comparing storms, they always mostly just bring up 78. And I think that might still be the monster, that and the Portland Gale, as far as nor'easters go. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. When you talk about the grandmother that got washed away,
Mm-hmm.
did her grandson survive that?
I'm trying to remember which one that was.
The one that went for dance.
Oh, it was just her and her nephew. It was the nephew. She didn't survive, he did, because he had gone for gas. So when he came back, he couldn't find her. And somebody had told him that they saw the figure of her walking from the car, and then she just kind of disappeared because they couldn't see the rain and everything. You couldn't see very far during that. So she just disappeared. And of course the waves had gotten her. So that's what happened. Fortunately for him, he made it. Yeah.
One slide so I can capture where you're going to be.
Oh, sure. That's also online at my website, dwcapecod.com/events. And that's those are the events coming up. Anyone else? Yeah.
What you recommend we should evacuate or make plans to evacuate next time we have, whenever the next huge storm comes?
I would say if they tell you to get out and you can, get out. I strongly recommend that.
That have to be. I've only lived on Cape for a few years.
Yeah. There were cases I know where people have been told to get out and they don't. I don't know what happened specifically to some of those people. They probably, at the very least, went through some severe damage to their property. But the thing is, especially in 1938, and 1944, there were people who were told, get out. And, maybe in 38, I think some of the people that were killed probably were forewarned. At least they probably didn't have a lot of time. There was another story, I think it was the 44 storm, where a guy got a phone call from his neighbor, and the lady wanted to it was about babysitting. The woman's daughter was going to babysit, and he said, never mind that. He said, look out your window at the water at Vineyard Sound. Get out of your house now. She didn't. That's why they ended up being killed. It was 1938. It was a woman, her sister, and 3 kids didn't make it because they didn't get the urgency. They were told to get out. So whenever, especially if authorities tell you, like the weather service, evacuate, get out. It's also a tough thing to get out, though. You see those signs on Route 6 now that are there, the evacuation. Yeah. You know when those came about? This was after Labor Day weekend of 1996. Hurricane Edward was a storm that was forecast to hit the area. There was a hurricane warning for Cape Cod on Labor Day weekend. Imagine that. Now, my wife and I were out in Provincetown that weekend, and Friday, I was starting to hear rumblings. The warnings were starting to come through. And I said to her, we ought to think about leaving tomorrow. She said, why? I said, because this hurricane that's coming. This is going to be a mess out here if a hurricane hits. So we got off. We were living off Cape at the time. And we got off Cape just fine. The next day, the warning came. The hurricane warning. The traffic jam at the Bourne Bridge, at the Sagamore Bridge, going on Route 6, not back to Sandwich, not back to Barnstable, not back to Yarmouth, not back to Dennis, not back to Harwich or Brewster, to the Rotary in Orleans and Eastham. That's how far back the traffic went. And 8 hours for some people to get off the Cape because of this hurricane warning. And here it was. Here's the Cape. The storm was supposed to come and hit right on. During the night, it went off to the side. It went out to sea. They barely felt it.
It was the prettiest and the least congested Labor Day weekend.
Yes, got it right, Paul. You got it right. It was pretty crazy. And that's why those signs are there, though, now, because they got to have a way to get off the Cape. Like you don't know it already. Go ahead. Oh, back there.
Pop, I just still roll up in the morning and look at it. And I was here, but I remember not being that worried about it. All of a sudden we rolled up and we had the right address and change direction.
Yeah, they were watching that one pretty closely, and I think there was some doubts about what it was going to do. But that one came. That one was roughly across southeastern Mass, I think, or maybe just west of there. But that's where it ended up going. But
Speed of the bridge when they shut it down.
I think it's 80 miles an hour, 80, just above hurricane force. That's when they shut it down. You can't go over. You can't use it at all. So yeah, that's another thing to keep in mind if you're trying to get off the Cape and there's a hurricane hitting and you want to try to get off the Cape. You can't do it because you won't be able to get over the bridge. And you sure as don't want to use a boat or a plane at that point. Yeah.
We're fairly new to the Cape.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you evacuating to? I mean, you just keep going west until you can get
Away from the storm.
A hotel.
Yeah, a lot of people do. A lot of people do. They go to a hotel off Cape. They might go.
So you have to know ahead of time to get a hotel.
That's why you have to. Yeah, that's true too. That's a tough situation. If you're thinking about evacuating, either that or if you know somebody, which, I was living off Cape, but we probably wouldn't have felt it nearly as much of it as the Cape would have if it did hit straight on. But that never happened. So that was a near miss. The highest point? Oh, like if a tidal wave hit or something like that? Truro Highlands, Dennis Highlands come to mind. Those are two of the higher spots I can think of. Because some of those neighborhoods, even along the bay, like Barnstable, Sandwich, Dennis, 6A will flood if the tide is extremely high. And you can't get through. So you want to be up and away from the near the coast, anywhere near the shore at that point. But if an extreme case of, yeah, get to the highest point you can find. Yes,
Thank you, Mr. White, for an excellent presentation.
thank you for coming.
I have a question about, in the middle of the slide, you mentioned about the residents in Buckingham. And as we all understand, that the fishermen, the boats, it's very hard for them to navigate because of the undercurrents of the oceans are very strong.
Yeah, Cuttyhunk's been notorious for shipwrecks too.
So the residents, do they get at present now, do they get a very early morning to evacuate the island in case?
Something like that. Well, they've survived the storms there because the island itself hasn't been submerged or anything like that. So the best thing to do, if you're stuck on the island, which in the case of Cuttyhunk, a lot of people probably are if you're a resident there. There's only so many ways to get off of Cuttyhunk Island. I understand it's only a ferry from New Bedford that runs occasionally, and it also depends on the time of the year. Or boat, the boat, or if you're flying. Other than that, once you get hurricane force winds, neither one's really an option. So you're kind of stuck there otherwise. And that could apply to here too. You can, if you want to get out of here and the wind's blowing 85 miles an hour, you're not going anywhere because you're not getting over the bridge. So at that point, then you just have to hunker down, get into the safest place you could possibly be. I'm inland here on the Cape. I live in a low-level apartment, which is actually pretty good for, we're away from the water too. So we're not, we don't have to worry. We had a lot of trees down outside, but we don't have to worry about a lot of things, like a lot of other property owners might, especially if you're right near the water, where the storm surge could come in. So just stay as safe as you can, get to a high spot or a place where the floodwaters are not going to reach you, or less likely to anyway. I hope that answers what you're looking for. One more, or should we call it a day? One more, here we go.
So, and what storm put the LD up on the beach in East Down?
That was in 1984, late March of 84, probably this week, actually. And I don't recall if the storm had any name. It had like 60-mile-an-hour winds to it. So it was severe conditions. Thing that most people remember from that week is not the storm itself, but the Aldea running into trouble and beaching itself. I covered that in my shipwrecks book. And that was a pretty dire situation at the time when it happened, because the rescue of the Aldea, they still had the storm conditions going on, and they had to rescue, I think it was 17 people off of the ship. And they had to take them in bits and pieces. There might have been a few more than that. But I think they had a few in the first one, and then there was 13 in the second haul, a helicopter with a basket that they hauled people off on. And then the third one was a few more, and they were fortunate because the helicopter was running out of fuel at that point too. So it was a pretty heroic effort, but they got everybody off, no lives lost or anything like that. But it was just this monstrosity freighter that got stuck in the sand. It got kind of off track because of the storm, but that was the biggest noteworthy event from that storm. That and the people who made a lot of money, either selling merchandise, photographs and coffee mugs of the Aldea, or some of the other crazy things that happened afterwards. There was one guy I know who has a beach camp down on Nauset Beach. He did all right for himself, shuttling people back and forth from the parking lot to the site of the Aldea, because that was a pretty good hike from where the Aldea came ashore compared to where the parking lot was. So yeah, he made himself a few bucks as a taxi service during that storm. Anyone else? We can wrap this up. All right, thank you for coming. I will be here at the table. I got some books. If you're interested.